So if you've been paying attention to the news lately, then you've likely seen that Congress and the president did something mind-boggling for Washington, D.C. They came together to pass sweeping reforms to the criminal justice system. Now keep in mind, Congress itself has such a bad reputation for gridlock and inaction that one poll found that Americans had a higher opinion of traffic jams and Nickelback than they did of Congress. And I'm not quite sure which is worse. But despite a reputation for partisanship and divide, both sides of the political aisle in Washington, D.C. put aside their differences at the end of 2018 to pass the First Step Act, a bill designed to give inmates training and education while they're in prison so they can be better prepared to reenter society. Now, given the fact that 95% of current prisoners will at some point be released back into their neighborhoods and back into their communities, criminal justice reform is not just good for politics, it's good for public safety. We should all celebrate giving a second chance to those who are ready to improve their lives, because we know that the revolving door of recidivism can be shut when we set inmates up for success. But achievements like the First Step Act, while inspiring and crucial to fix our broken criminal justice system, are the exception in federal lawmaking and not the rule. On average, every year in Congress, 10,000 bills are introduced, but only 4% actually ever become law. The last time a major federal criminal justice bill that made sweeping changes to the criminal justice system was actually passed was in 2010 with the Fair Sentencing Act, again in 2007 with the Second Chance Act, and on a more negative note, the 1994 crime bill, which imposed harsh penalties and contributed to over-incarceration. It's clear from this trend that although lawmakers are willing to introduce good bills, the odds are actually higher for any member of this audience to hit a hole-in-one in golf than for sweeping changes to the criminal justice reform, that the criminal justice system actually be passed. Now, as someone who works for a policy advocacy organization, it is my job to help pass legislation to remove barriers of opportunity for all people, especially the least advantaged. Passing bills and working with lawmakers is a vital element to reform. And I am by no means minimizing the need to enact additional reforms. In many ways, legislation is the best option to create lasting change for all Americans. But something I've come to realize is this. It's the greatest potential for change in the criminal justice system is not always found in the halls of Congress. Instead, it is found in the decisions we make every day without deliberation. The types of decisions that have met with intention and a vision for a better future could improve the criminal justice system. Let me give you one major problem that needs to be addressed: overcriminalization. A huge part of the problem in the United States is that we tend to lock up too many people for too long. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the entire world, even when you compare it to other developed nations. We have 2.3 million people in prison or jail, and we pay $80 billion every year to maintain the system. In 1980, the federal prison population was at 25,000 people. That number today is just under 200,000. In 1980, the combined total of all 50 state prisons in America had 500,000 people. Today, that number is at 1.3 million. So how on earth did we get here? The answer lies in part with a default preference to continually pass new laws criminalizing behavior. If you're a lawmaker, it's much easier to pass a crime than to repeal one. It's easier to be tough on crime than it is to be lenient. And with every crisis in our country, there's a push from the public and lawmakers to do something. And very often, the type of thing that looks the boldest is to pass new crimes. This trend has caused an explosion in the criminal code. So in 1790, there were only 17 federal crimes. Today, that number is 5,000. But that doesn't count the over 300,000 regulations that carry a criminal penalty. But you know what? This is only a best guess, because no one, not even the Department of Justice, has been able to come up with a complete list of how many crimes are on the books. The official answer to this question is, we don't know. Now, when the crimes in the books are paired with harsh sentencing and mandatory minimums, it should be no surprise that arrest and incarceration rates are going to increase. The crimes on the federal level have been mirrored in the states, where local crimes duplicate federal ones, and vice versa. In Alabama, barbering without a license is a misdemeanor crime, punishable by 90 days in jail. In California, unauthorized possession of a commercial bakery basket is punishable by 6 months in jail. In Florida, lobbyists from the interior design industry convinced legislators to pass a law declaring that anyone who practices interior design without a license should be punished by up to 1 year in prison. You better watch out before you rearrange your furniture. And as absurd as these laws can seem, the rise of overcriminalization has led to severe consequences. Ordinary behavior has now become subject to criminal enforcement, when most Americans would never suspect that their actions were against the law. Let me give you a few examples. In 2014, Arnold Abbott, a 90-year-old World War II veteran, tried to feed the homeless in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Arnold ran a charity called Love Thy Neighbor, which provided free meals to those in need. Now, during the time of Arnold's service to the community, Fort Lauderdale passed an ordinance which placed restrictions on feeding the homeless. And Arnold believed that in order to comply with those strict regulations, he would have to shut down his charity. He did not see that as an option he could live with. As Arnold put it, any human has the right to help his fellow man. So, Arnold continued to give free meals to those in need. But instead of being applauded for doing an act of public service, Arnold was charged with violating that city ordinance and faced a potential punishment of 60 days in jail for feeding the homeless. Fortunately for Arnold, media attention caused the city to back down and dismiss the charges. But the damage of the new law that imposed criminal penalties had already been done. Instead of upholding a moral understanding of the criminal law, the urge to use criminal enforcement to solve an ordinance issue almost ended by jailing a 90-year-old World War II veteran who posed no threat to public safety. A similar incident happened in 2017 in Washington, D.C. Now, if you've ever visited Washington, D.C. during the summer, the heat and the humidity are going to make you immediately get out your phone, go on Zillow, and see how quickly can I buy an igloo in Alaska. That is how hot it gets. And so knowing how bad the heat was, 3 teenage boys decided to sell water bottles to anyone who's going to be walking from the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. It came as a shock to them when they were handcuffed by the United States Park Police for illegally selling water. Instead of simply warning these young men that they needed to go through proper channels, the police detained and handcuffed these aspiring entrepreneurs who had opened the modern-day form of a lemonade stand. Well, let's ask ourselves, why did drastic action like that get escalated to such a level? Because Washington, D.C. had established criminal penalties for unlicensed vendors, including punishment by 90 days in jail. When the tools for criminal enforcement are provided by the legislature in federal, state, or local government, we should not be surprised when negative outcomes occur. And while many of these incidents did not actually result in incarceration, the fact of an arrest or charge can be a permanent stain on an individual's record, preventing them from succeeding in their education or their career. So what can be done? The first thing to do is to stop the bleeding. Whether it is Congress, a state legislature, or a city council, policymakers should pause the creation of new crimes and evaluate whether any new proposed law is actually needed. In the rare instance of life where some part of our society has not already been regulated, policymakers should carefully consider whether civil penalties instead of jail time is a better option. Not every undesirable conduct needs to be handled with the force of criminal law. And perhaps the best option is to consider whether inaction is the best response. Not every malady of life needs a new law to fix the problem. You know, it's counterinstinctual for those of us in the policy world to urge lawmakers to not pass crimes, but given the rapid growth of our criminal code and the real-world consequences that they have on Americans from all walks of life, shutting down bad laws can actually be a tremendous step forward to fixing problems in the criminal justice system. And I've talked so far mostly about the proliferation of new crimes, but there are many more areas that are ripe for reform that can take place without ever changing the law. Take, for instance, police and community relations. It is crucial that law enforcement can work to keep the public safe while building trust. And long before anyone comes and sits in a prison or sits in a courtroom, they're going to be interacting with the front line of the criminal justice system, the police. And this responsibility brings enormous power. So how can the police contribute to reform? Well, one of the easiest ways to do is the hard work of becoming familiar with the communities in which they serve. A recent study by the Police Foundation found that when officers switched from driving around their patrol cars in certain neighborhoods and instead conducted foot patrols, 60% of the community groups believed that it increased the legitimacy of the police and trust. And as one person in the study explained, what happens is, instead of looking at them as the police, you see them as humans who are trained to help, assist, and protect you. So it's not just the police. It's our police officer who knows my block and who knows that's a dark street, and they're going to be there. Making small decisions to build community trust can have an outsized impact, and it restores faith in the criminal justice system. Prosecutors can also make an important change without ever waiting for a new law to pass. Already, district attorneys across the United States are wisely using their discretion about how they make charging decisions. So instead of charging a first-time non-violent drug offender with a felony, which can have lasting damage to a person's chance of gaining employment, prosecutors can evaluate whether a misdemeanor charge makes better sense and serves justice. Even further, prosecutors can also recommend defendants to diversion programs or drug courts, avoiding incarceration altogether. In this way, the costly method of relying on jails and prisons is reduced, while public safety is increased by improving and focusing on the underlying condition of addiction or giving mercy for youthful mistakes. Prosecutors have vast power and resources at their disposal, and it can be used to reform the criminal justice system if thoughtful, wise decisions are made about how to ensure accountability and not just punishment for its own sake. You know, judges can also have the power to implement reforms without any need for legislation. Close to 500,000 people are sitting behind bars right now, awaiting trial, and many of them are locked up because they are too poor to afford money bail. The detention of people who cannot afford bail costs taxpayers every year $12 billion. And keep in mind, this is pre-trial, which means no one has yet been convicted of a crime. To uphold the principles of due process and the concept of innocent until proven guilty, judges can adopt reforms to help change the situation. Instead of relying solely on cash as the determining factor about whether someone is released, judges should ask whether someone is a danger to the community or a serious flight risk, and then decide whether detention makes sense. As the Supreme Court has said, in our society, liberty is the norm, and detention prior to trial or without trial is the carefully limited exception. Judges can play an important part to restore the presumption of liberty in the criminal justice system. You know, all these changes are crucial to reforming the law, but they don't require waiting until a law is passed. But you know what? There's another more vital aspect to reform that could have more impact than anything else I've mentioned tonight. And that's the need to change how culture views the criminal justice system. When I was in law school, I learned how prosecutors were supposed to lock people up. I memorized the rules of evidence, cross-examination techniques, and the best way to secure a conviction. But I didn't learn what happened to people once they were sent behind bars. It was easy to focus on the immediate and not the downstream effects of our actions. And I think that this view of the criminal justice system is similar for many in our culture. It's easy to think that as we lock people up, our communities are safer and justice has been served. But that's not always the case, because every single year, 650,000 people will be released back into our neighborhoods and back into our communities. And we have to ask ourselves, are we preparing people to be returning as productive citizens, keeping the community safe, or are we setting them up for failure? And time and time and time again, many people who come out of prison can't get a driver's license, can't get a loan, can't start a business, or obtain a professional license. All because our culture has demanded not just that the people who have committed an offense serve time in prison, but but that they be relegated to second-class status for the rest of their lives. No law, no crime, and no policy will ever change until society demands it. Politics is downstream of culture, and if we're concerned about the laws in the books, then we need to examine the judgment in our hearts. Criminal wrongdoing demands accountability, but it must be paired with mercy and the hope for a second chance. None of us would want to ever be judged forever by our worst day. So redemption must go hand in hand with our laws. So what are some practical steps we can take right now to help change culture without ever changing the law? Pay attention to when politicians argue for new crimes. It's helpful to let them know that not everyone in the public agrees that more law should be added to the books. If you own a business, consider hiring someone with a criminal record. They need a job to stay on a good path and very often end up becoming the best worker in the company. Visit someone in prison. Being incarcerated strips away a person's sense of humanity and self-worth. Remind them there is hope and forgiveness. And for those who are coming out of prison, you can help by assisting with a job search, providing transportation, and giving your time to help make reentry a success. All these things can transform the criminal justice system, but it can also transform you. By being an active participant in growing positive culture, you will make an invaluable contribution to someone else's life as well as your own. It's easy to leave all the issues with the legislature and hope that'll solve our problems, and some of them might. But sometimes, changing hearts and minds will do infinitely better than changing a law. And if you take a closer look at how the criminal justice system really operates, you can find endless ways to find reforming the system without ever changing the law. And I think if you choose this route, you might be surprised at how effective you can be. Thank you.